Welcome to Shit You Wish Your Building Did, the must-watch show for transforming your commercial spaces into smart buildings. Today, we're answering the important question: what does a bacon sandwich and the UK smart meter program have in common? Answer: both were chewed up by Ed Miliband. In 2009, the UK launched a smart meter program, which today's guest, Nick Hunn, describes as a classic example of a government IT disaster. 15 years later, we look at what has changed, if anything, and what it might mean for the UK's net zero policy going forward. Remember to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with our latest episodes. Ready to transform your building with smart technology? And let's jump right in. Well, welcome everybody, and a big welcome to wireless technology expert Nick Hunn. Lovely to have you on the podcast.
Hello, thank you very much.
And I read your excellent article, Nick, on the UK smart meter program, and that's why I've asked you on, because I thought it would be great to talk about this fascinating subject. So by way of introduction, this is something that, for those that don't know, right, in this year, July this year, UK had a change of government. And by some, I guess, quirk of fate, right, that the guy that was in charge of UK energy policy in 2009, is now back in charge 14 years later. So I think that's probably what sparked this renewed interest in the UK smart metering program. And I will link the article in the show notes. So if anyone wants to read it, please go ahead. So I think what stood out to me, Nick, was your phrase, a classic example of a government IT disaster. And I think, as most people will know, there are many. So I think a good place to start might be to give us a summary of, what this smart metering program was supposed to do and when it was announced 15 years ago.
Okay. Well, I mean, the basics is it was rolling out smart meters. So going back to the very basics, what's a smart meter and why do you want them? A smart meter is a meter that you've got in your home. It's like your existing electricity or gas meters, but it provides far more information on what you're actually doing. If you look at a standard, what are called dumb meters, the ones we typically have, they have a running total of how much energy you've used. And every 3 months or 6 months or every year, somebody used to come round, read it, and you'd be billed against what you used. Nobody, neither the electricity supplier or the householder, knew how much the individual appliances they were using were actually costing on that. It was a bit like if you went to the supermarket once a year, they would say, oh, you've bought £2,500 worth of stuff this year. Just pay me for it now. And it's an odd model because it's one of the few things that we pay in arrears with no real idea of how much we're using and what the bill is going to look like. Smart metering sort of grew on what was initially called automated metering systems. And those were meters that every day or every week or every month would send back how much you'd used in that period. And that meant that your utility could at least bill you on what you'd actually used rather than trying to estimate what you might use and generally charging you more as a way of persuading you that you ought to read your meter and tell them what you'd actually done. We've had AMI systems around the world for quite some time, and they're liked by utilities because they don't have to employ a metering force to go round. But generally, we didn't have very many of them because the cost of putting them out was more than the cost of having a little man or lady go round and reading your meter every 6 months. What the benefit of smart meters are is that they provide more information to more people. And the theory was that if you combine the benefit to all of those different stakeholders, then it would be worthwhile and cost effective to install them. So you would still have the benefit to the utility. It would tell them how much energy you're using. If you could provide that as real-time information to a customer, then they could see what they're using in terms of electricity and gas spend more or less in real time. So if you turned your kettle on, you could see that it was going to cost you 10 or 20p to boil the water. If you're having a shower, if it was an electric shower, you'd realize you could probably be better off being dirtier than you normally are. But it meant that customers could see a real benefit, because if they had that information, they could make choices, and that ought to reduce their energy bills. And the more important one going forward, as we move to a mix of intermittent energy generation as well as sort of base load, and that's because we're going to look at more and more wind and solar power, that same information on usage could go back to the grid and the generators so that they can make far better informed decisions about how much energy is going to be needed at particular times, and hence be able to negotiate better prices when you're looking at the energy balancing. And the theory was, if you put all of that together, then the overall returns would be greater than the cost of pushing out those meters. And there's nothing wrong in that. That's perfectly good reason. Lots of countries around the world have gone round and done smart metering because of that. The problem that we came across in the UK is who was put in charge of doing it. Normally, and I think in almost every other country in the world, the network operator has been in charge of deploying meters. So they have a vested interest of, first of all, making it work for them. Because they're the network operator, they can then put meters in street at a time. So it's a more cost-effective way of putting them in. You can plan what you're doing. The information the network operator needs is very much the same information that the consumer needs, so that comes on top of it. And then almost sort of as a last benefit, the utilities get that information automatically as they would have done with an earlier metering system. And had we taken that approach, I think everybody would have been quite happy. It may still have been a bit of a fiasco in rolling it out, but it would have done what they wanted. Instead, the view of the government was to give the job of rolling meters out, and in fact of designing the meters, to the utilities. And they really only had one view in mind, which was, oh, this is a cheap way of getting somebody else to pay for us to have automatic metering, and we don't really need any of the rest of the stuff. And so we've got some really poorly designed meters that were rolled out. They've been built by companies that have very little experience in how to build them, and nobody is really using or getting access to any of the data that would make them valuable. Now, normally, if this was a government-funded scheme, the Treasury would probably be jumping up and down and saying, we're not seeing what we'd hoped we'd see as a benefit from this. But they did a neat trick, was to say that these meters could be paid for by adding the cost of those onto consumers' bills. That way, the Treasury never saw it as a problem. The utilities didn't see it as a problem because it was just a cost they passed through. And nobody had any real interest in actually looking to see if it worked. And as it has gone on, it's become more and more obvious that it is not working in delivering any of those benefits which had been expected. Now, we're not alone in that. I mean, I remember a good 10 or more years back sitting in a conference over in California, which was going through the same thing at the same time. And the CEO of one of the energy companies there said, the best thing about these smart meters is it gives us more evidence to blame the customer. And that's pretty much the attitude that we have seen throughout the industry. As if we look at our utilities, they're not particularly technically advanced. If we just look at the way they're billing, I mean, for them, spreadsheets are still quite new. They aren't working out what to do with the data. And because they don't understand the data, they don't understand the benefits that customers might get from them. And so it's almost sort of a vicious circle going into the lowest common denominator of design, whereby nobody wins.
Very, very interesting. So I think you've done an excellent job there of summarising it. And I guess that's sort of like where we are at the moment. I guess it's just gone on and on, right? Nobody has really taken control of it. It's just it wasn't a problem for the government, and it's carried on. I mean, are there signs that people are talking about now that they're going to end it or they're going to change things?
Not obviously. Um, Unfortunately, the one thing which seems to have stuck is the government's target to say we need to have these smart meters in every
Mm.
home. And whereas it started off saying, well, this is voluntary, customers can decide whether they want them, we've seen enough issues that more and more customers are saying, I don't want one of these. Um, Most of that is probably prejudice, but we are seeing the meters not working. Whereas the actual smart meters designed to have 20, 25-year life, the in-home display, which is the only bit that a customer will actually be able to get benefit from, only has a 12-month design
Okay.
life. And many of those are failing. They use a wireless technology that's largely been ignored by the rest of the world. They don't automatically connect to anything on your phone or your Wi-Fi network. They don't use the common things like Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. And it's very much a legacy product that provides minimal benefit. I mean, we don't know how many are working. As you just think, if you're deploying a system where you are putting in an in-home display, you'd at least want to monitor to see if it's being used, or at least if it's
Mm.
still powered on. But we don't do that. We have no idea how many of them are working.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Um,
And is there? I mean, obviously they set this target then of not just the wireless display, but the actual smart meter of getting them into every single home. I mean, have they at least been able to track progress in that respect?
we've got figures from that. DEC and then BASE and now the new department for net zero are producing figures of the installation numbers. There is a lot of debate as to where they are, but we're probably only just past the halfway mark in terms of total numbers of
Mm.
meters deployed. Um, the government is putting pressure on utilities to deploy more, even to the point of saying they're starting to fine them for lack of installation. None of which actually helps to push the message as to why people
Mm.
should have these. So the pressure is to complete the program, and it's almost as if it's just saying, we've got a tick box, we just
Mm.
need to finish it. And you think, well, it's beginning to get a little bit like HS2. Why don't you just stop and say, what do you actually
Mm.
want to do? Because as we now move into a far less difficult grid to manage, because we do have an awful lot of green energy coming in from intermittent sources, we need to know more and more about this, as do customers, particularly as we're putting in things like demand flexibility schemes, in order to make this work better. And it probably means that rather than pushing ahead, we would do far, far better with saying, look, it's not working. What do we actually need? And let's start thinking seriously about the next generation of smart meters that really
Mm.
work and deliver, rather than just concentrating on pushing out devices that are probably close to being
Mm.
obsolete already.
So, what do you think that we need and at the moment? 2024. If you were throwing away that old program, had a blank sheet of paper, what would a smart meter program look like?
I think a smart meter program needs to stop, look at what we want. Um, One of the issues I think around smart meters we have today, which has added a lot to the cost, is because they were being pushed out by the energy suppliers, a feature that they wanted was the ability to remotely disconnect household supply. And they want that for two reasons. One is that it means they can cut somebody off if they haven't paid, and it's also easier for them to bring new properties up and running when
Mm.
people move without having to
Mm.
send somebody in. The issue with having that off switch is it means that if masses of meters are hacked and turned off at the same time, it becomes a major issue in terms of energy security in the country. If you could turn off 1 million meters at once and then an hour later turn them back on again and bounce it up and down, it'll take out quite a lot of the grid. That means that each one of these meters is now effectively a piece of national infrastructure in your home. It's the only piece of national infrastructure any of us have in our home. And you could go with a much simpler meter that doesn't do that. I think there's interesting things we could do, which is, first and foremost, make sure the data off those meters is far more easily available. It should talk straight to an app on your phone. It shouldn't have to go through a custom piece of equipment that's supplied by a utility. We need to make sure that people understand how you can use that better. There's a lot more integration that's going to be needed with making sure these work with local generation, whether that's solar cells on your house, heat pumps, which is, I think, another potential disaster down the line, but that may be a subject for another day. But also, if you just look at small storage batteries of sort of 2 to 3 kilowatt hours, you don't need much more than that in every home to more or less level out demand for most of the country. So there's a future going forward looking at distributed local energy systems, which ought to go into that thinking of what goes in a smart meter. It's not something we should be designing for essentially a business model that has been pretty much unchanged probably since the 1920s, but looking at how do we put something in each home that is both safe, secure, and designed for our energy needs going forward over the next 20 to 50 years.
Yeah, excellent points. And like you said, I think these sort of concept of having a wireless display, whilst, of course, any information is useful, but it's sort of now redundant, right? With people carrying displays in their pockets, we may as well not bother with that part.
Yeah.
You've touched on there sort of this the changes in energy transmission, more distributed. How and that's one part of the change we're seeing with the grid. There's also the policy part, right? How and again, this kind of ties back into the fact Ed Miliband now is back in charge of UK energy policy. Mm-hmm. How or does this program have any impact on UK reaching their net zero goals, or is it sort of slightly like just an aside thing that's been going on and an annoyance?
I think it's purely aside and an annoyance. It can certainly have an impact. We do need to help people understand their energy usage. And still, I think we're at the point where most people don't know what it is that is responsible for a lot of their energy usage. We have an issue that a lot of it, certainly in terms of heat, is because we traditionally have been building very poorly insulated homes. And that's a problem that remains with us. About 2/3 of our housing stock has a poor energy rating. And one of the things that we should be concentrating on far more is just looking at how do we take a fabric first approach in terms of insulation and making better use of the energy that we have. And it's one of those odd ones that sort of, we're probably both of an age we can remember when you used to get insulation grants for going and buying a sort of roll of fiberglass from B&Q to put in. There is probably a lot to be said for that, of just going back to a lot of people to say, how do you make your home more insulated, better fit for energy? Instead of which we have subsidies for heat pumps, many of which were going into buildings which really aren't suitable for a heat pump. So some joined up thought, I think, needs to come in about that. We are seeing more and more local generation. People are still putting solar cells out. How do we usefully feed back in? How do we look at sensible tariffs for all of that? It's more, I think, taking a holistic approach for how do we make best use of our energy usage, and also how do we then complement that with a move towards renewable energy. and understand that we might need to be pragmatic in some of these things. Um, there is nuclear that has a part of it. There has been 50 years of government dislike of nuclear for various reasons. But we need to think about what our energy needs, and what's the most pragmatic step forward. I mean, China, in a way, if you look at a large scale, is quite interesting because, on the one hand, you see the amazing growth of electric vehicles over there, but at the same time, the realization that many of them being charged with electricity generated by
Right.
coal-fired plants. And you say that's anachronistic, it shouldn't happen. And that's absolutely true. But then if you say, well, 10 years down the line, what's going to happen is we'll have even more EVs, but most of those coal plants will have been decommissioned and they will have clean energy. And you can see how you get to that long-term solution that you want. And it worries me when I look at a lot of the sound bites from our current energy policy. It seems to assume that you can do all of the right things together at the same time. And history tends to say it doesn't work like that. We are going to need mixes of things. And how do you pragmatically roll those together to get the best result 10, 15, 20 years down the line, rather than just a bland statement that sounds good in your next election manifesto?
Yes, and well, that brings a kind of political element to it, right? That energy policy really is about 15, 20 years in the future, not
Yes.
5 year political cycles, unfortunately. I guess also, I mean, it's okay to make mistakes, right, if you learn from them. Do you think that there have been any lessons learned from this program, or in your opinion?
It's difficult to say until you get to the next program, because the current approach is we've got to finish the current one, which suggests at least at one level, no lessons have been learnt. It's the point of where do you say, stop hitting your head against the wall, it hurts. So there were lessons learned or lessons enforced. And I remember on a security one, when I was sitting in a meeting and said, well, look, there's an issue here, people could hack the meters. And the response coming back from a utility was, well, why would anybody want to do that? And their mindset was still around people sort of dangling 6p coins on a piece of string as a way of tampering, rather than thinking, what does it mean if you actually change your vision and say, this is a cybersecurity risk across the whole of the grid? Now, those learnings seem to have sunk in. I mean, not least because GCK HQ came in and battered everyone round the head about this is what you need to do it properly. But in terms of deployments, in terms of thinking, how could you make this more efficient to get the rollout happening? Not a lot of that seems to have changed. And when you see some of the issues coming up with smart meters, and we see the headlines of somebody's been charged sort of 33,000 instead of 3,000, and you think, this actually says your back end systems aren't even doing the basics of checking to see if a bill is anomalous. And that implies there's no real learning of what data is about and how do you use data. So I think there is a lot that still needs to change, because much of smart metering is so far out of the comfort zone of people within utilities that is a lesson being learnt when you don't actually understand what the lesson is?
Yes, I suspect not. Yeah. I know. Okay, I'm going to go there because you've mentioned heat pumps twice. So I am intrigued. And it kind of similar, right? I mean, we're talking about bringing in electrical devices. Is there, what's your opinion there then? You think that this is also sort of something that is misguided, bringing? Yeah.
I think it is, and there's been a very good sales job on heat pumps as the way to make a home far more efficient, far more competent for electricity. The issue is that an awful lot of properties, heat pumps don't work very well. You don't need to be up to sort of full passive house standards for a heat pump to work, but you do need a well-insulated house. If you look at the way that heat pumps are sold, there's quite an easy and simple way to say, is my house well enough insulated for a heat pump? And that's find a cold winter's day, turn your heating system down to 50 degrees, which is about the temperature of water you're going to get through a heat pump system. And if it starts to feel cold, you either need to insulate it first or put a lot more radiators in. And the vast majority of British homes, that's going to be the case. We've also got the same sort of thing that happened with smart meters, that one of the reasons the smart meters aren't that bright is that the utilities went out to their existing suppliers of dumb meters and said, can you make a smart meter? Now, those meter manufacturers, I mean, they're really good at metalwork, they're good at welding, all of that sort of stuff. But suddenly they were being thrown into secure wireless comms, and they didn't know which way to look. If you had a CV and you just put sort of meter and Zigbee and wireless on, you could have got a job. The problem is there are jobs in places nobody wanted to be, as most meter manufacturers tended to be agricultural instrument equipment suppliers sort of 10, 20 years earlier out in the sticks, which wasn't where bright young techies tended to work. And we're seeing the same sort of thing with heat pumps, is because they potentially cannibalize gas boilers. Gas boiler manufacturers are being encouraged to turn themselves into heat pump manufacturers. They haven't got the patents and the IPs for them. They haven't necessarily got the bright young people. It's a bit like sort of go back 100 years, a politician seeing cars come in would go out to sort of horse breeders and say, can you do horses with wheels? And we just haven't learned that if you're making radical shifts in technology, that will have impacts on industries. And you need to think about what's the most efficient way to get the product we want, rather than just saying, well, let's see if we can evolve the people that are currently our suppliers. And I mean, that's an issue for politicians. No politician is going to want to say, I'm going to support a bill that will actually result in industry in my particular constituency sort of going down.
I had a couple more questions for you. One, I mean, we talk a lot on this podcast as well about commercial buildings. They're not particularly involved in the. We've been talking more about residential, but I'm also interested in your opinion on that. I mean, how do you see commercial buildings, what their role is in our future energy infrastructure?
We're probably seeing more happening in commercial buildings at the moment than we are in domestic, to be perfectly honest. Not least because at the point of refurbishment, there tends to be money available to do that in a way that there's not when you're looking at individual homes. And also, I mean, for the residential, we shouldn't forget that there are very large numbers of homes that are in housing associations or councils, and the cost of upgrading those, let alone maintaining them, is crippling for many councils. Within larger commercial buildings, I think you've got a lot more opportunity. It's often a lot easier if there's a whole building refurb to do the complete fabric and upgrade for that. And that's important because if you're looking for better insulated buildings, you've got to think about the ventilation as well. It's far more of a whole building approach. I think the interesting aspect of that also is a renewed growth in looking at district heating. We're seeing district heating schemes coming in, which can work very well for commercial buildings. I was quite amused to see the association for that advertising in private eye, presumably lobbying governments, and thinking, have you noticed how much the government noticed all of the Horizon and post office scandals in private eye? They might talk about it, but do they actually read and do anything about it? But it's back on the agenda, and I think that's good. It has a mix we don't see that much of it in the UK, far less than you see on
Indeed.
the continent. So I think commercial buildings, as well as having that more organized approach and ability to do a complete building upgrade at one point where you can sit down and cost it. And also most buildings, when you're looking at the facilities management going in, you are putting in far more control and monitoring than will go into a domestic house. So you can actually see what changes and see what the payback is and cost it and manipulate it as you go along. And that, in theory, should provide learnings that can move out. It's fascinating with all of the data from smart metering. Virtually no research has been done on whether it actually helps.
Wow.
And I worked in an energy analytics startup about 10, 15 years ago. And one thing we saw is that people would make a change when they first got information about what they did. But within 6 months, it had drifted back to the norm.
Okay.
And it's like so many things. It's like you sign up for the gym on the 1st of January, but by February you've stopped going. And we need to think of how can you change that? Maybe at some point, some of this intelligence gets built into products themselves. But that's something that people have been promoting for 30 years and it still isn't really there. And we do see domestic usage going down, and year on year for the past 20 years, it's been decreasing, but that's mainly due to things like TVs and washing machines and fridges getting more efficient as the global regulations change.
Well, that's a good thing. But yeah, just one part of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nick, fascinating conversation. Thank you for those. I think you really did a great job of explaining things very clearly and in easy to understand terms. Last thing I wanted to ask you, is there one thing from things that we've discussed that you would want listeners to take away from the conversation?
I think the thing I would like people to take away is to think about how, first and foremost, this benefits the grid. And there's a lot of me that would like to say, think first and foremost about the customer, because the industry does a very poor job of informing customers about their electricity and energy usage. But we are seeing massive changes happening in our grid. And the most important thing, I think, for any government, any minister, is to look out into the future to say, how do we secure our energy? The demands are changing, generation is changing, and we need as much data as possible to make it easy for the people that are both investing in generation and investing in the grid to understand what to do it. And today with smart meters, we are largely throwing that data away. And it's how do we use that better for our energy security has to be anybody's number one.
Yes, brilliant. And a great place to finish. Thank you.